Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here, and we're excited that we're here for the 2022 Anti-Corruption and Anti-Fraud Conference at Dorsey and Whitney. We have the benefit of being hybrid this year, which is super exciting. We have an audience here live. It's so wonderful to see people. Thank you so much for coming. Stick around to the end because we have a nice opportunity to spend more time together at the end of the conference. And welcome to all of you that are part of the webinar. My name is Jay Jackson. I'm a partner at Dorsey, and I'm a member of the trial group. And again, we're excited to have you here. A couple of housekeeping items to talk about for those both on the webinar and locally, the materials and the attendance form. There was a link to it in the email you received, the reminder email you received yesterday. So be sure to get access to the materials. They're useful and helpful in the attendance form. There's also some CLE information, and as you'll hear during the presentations today, we will give you the CLE code that you can use in recording and therefore receiving your CLE credit. We're going to have the opportunity during both presentations for questions and responses to those questions. For those of you on the webinar, please use the chat function that's available to you. And for those in the audience, raise your hand, please. So 2021, remember 2021? Was another banner year when it came to anti-fraud and anti-corruption efforts. Among other things, our first speaker, Professor Brian Klaas, published his book, Corruptible, published at the end of the year. And he is going to give a presentation today that derives itself from that book. And our second panel is a group of experts, both in-house and a member of our firm, who are going to talk about developments in the regulatory and enforcement fields during the year 2021 and the first part of 2022. So again, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Great to see all of you that are present. And let's proceed with our first presentation. So we have the pleasure today of having Professor Brian Klaas here, as I mentioned, the author of the book published at the end of 2021, Corruptible. Professor Klaas is an associate professor in global politics at University College London. He's a graduate of Carleton College, where he received Phi Beta Kappa. He has a master's in philosophy, in comparative government from the University of Oxford, St. Antony's, and a doctor of philosophy from the University of Oxford in politics from the New College there. He is a frequent lecturer. He publishes regularly for the Washington Post. His articles have appeared in all the major publications throughout the Western world, at least I can put it that way. And he is the host of a episodic podcast that goes by the name of Power Corrupts. So we're excited to have Professor Klaas here. We're going to begin with a presentation from Professor Klaas, which will last anywhere in the 35 to 40 minute range. And then I will have an opportunity to throw some questions at Professor Klaas to see if we can get some more detail and ideas from him that might be helpful to all of you. And again, if you have questions that you wish to ask him, save them if you're live in the audience and then post them in the chat. So with that, let's proceed with Professor Klaas.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Jay. It's such a pleasure to be here for so many reasons. I mean, one is I'm originally Minnesotan, as you may have guessed. But also there is the aspect where the Dorsey firm has many, many links to my family. My dad was a former partner at Dorsey, and therefore I have the Dorsey firm and its many satisfied corporate clients to thank for much of my education being paid for. So the wisdom that comes out of this book links very much back to the Dorsey firm. So thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be addressing all of you. Now, what I wrote in this book and what I started to study was these questions that came out of about 10 years of research that I did around the world, meeting some very unsavory, often highly corrupt people. And those people are, the kind where you sit in a room and they tell you some horrific story about how they ordered torture or how they committed war crimes or how they rigged elections. And I would come back to places like Minnesota where I would talk to friends and family. And something that people said to me was, that sort of reminds me of my old boss, or it reminds me of the guy who got caught embezzling at my company. And so I started to think a little bit more deeply about whether there were commonalities between the people I was seeing in the sort of extreme level of human depravity and the power abusers closer to home, those people who sort of skirt the rules, break them, and see what they can get away with. And that's where this book really came out of. So the main questions that I ask in the book there's 4 of them. One is, do worse people get power? The second, does power make people worse? Often referred to from the Lord Acton quote of, does power tend to corrupt? Third, why do we let people control us who clearly have no business being in control? This brings the mirror back onto us. Why do we allow awful people to be in charge of our societies? And the fourth is how can we ensure that incorruptible people will get power instead? So let's start with the conventional wisdom. Does power corrupt? This is what most people think, right? When I talk to people about my work, they often trot that Lord Acton quote back to me and they say, oh, yes, I already know about this. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Now, this is true, as I will talk about in the preceding lecture, but it's only the very tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on with dynamics around corruption and power, as I've found in my research, and this is just a very small part of the story. The flip side, the alternative hypothesis, is that corruptible people seek power. It's a bit of a chicken or an egg question. Is it that power takes good people and spits them out bad? Or is it that the bad people gravitate towards power and are better at getting it? As I hope I'll convince you, it's a bit of both. But I want to start with a story from my research of this woman here who's known as Ma Anand Sheela. Now, Sheela grew up in India, and she was a very normal person who had aspirations to go to art school, which she was able to do at the age of 18. She ended up in the United States in New Jersey. And she, like many people in the 1960s and 70s, started to get involved in sort of new age thinking, trying to find a deeper meaning to life. And she gravitated towards a man named Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, a guru who sort of became a sort of cult leader in India. Now, she was eventually tasked with moving the cult to Oregon and to setting up a significant property where the teachings of the guru could be shared with lots of followers, particularly lots of Hollywood people who would empty their coffers happily into the guru's pocket so he could continue his operation. And what Sheela did was she scoped out this city, this small town called Antelope, Oregon. She bought this massive ranch called the Big Muddy Ranch, and she built effectively a city, complete with an international airport. And over time, thousands of people gravitated towards this place. And she became more and more powerful. She became the PR person for this entire movement known as the Rajnishis. And over time, as she amassed this power, she started to get away with a bit more, and she started to skirt the rules, and she started to think a bit bigger about what she could do to enact the will of the guru that she served. And in particular, she faced a problem where the city government tried to shut her down, tried to shut the operation of the Rajnishis down. And so what she decided to do was to simply have the Americans among the group run for the city council, because there were about 45 residents of Antelope, Oregon, and there were thousands of Rajnishis. And lo and behold, they took over the town, they won the city council race, and they ended up renaming the city Rajneeshpuram after the Rajnishis. But then the county wanted to shut her down. And so she came up with another plan. She said, okay, we'll run for the county office. But there weren't enough people to win these elections. In other words, there were about 85,000 people in the county. They only had a couple thousand Rajnishis. They weren't going to be able to outvote the county residents. So she came up with this ambitious plan to rig the election. And to do it, she wanted to poison the voters of the county to ensure that they would not vote on the appointed day, depressing the turnout and making it more likely that the Rajnishis could control the county government. So in a test run for this, it's hard to believe it's a test run, but she poisoned 1,000 people by sprinkling salmonella on various salad bars throughout the area in this county in Oregon. And thankfully, nobody died, but many people were seriously, they're hospitalized with serious illness. And as the federal government and some of the investigators started to wise up to her, they raided the property eventually and found all sorts of plots to kill various federal attorneys, to try to find a way to weaponize HIV, which was a new disease at the time, and also potentially to kill people on behalf of the guru that she served, the person that she believed was a god on earth. It's the classic story of power corrupting. So I went to meet her a couple years ago, and she currently lives in Switzerland, where, believe it or not, the Swiss government has deemed this the worst bioterrorist in American history, a person who was deported after serving several years in prison. They have put her in charge of a care home for vulnerable people, which is where I met her. And what's striking about this is that she has, to all appearances, done literally nothing against the law or even morally objectionable since she moved to Switzerland. As far as we can tell, there's no evidence of wrongdoing. It is the most classic case I've come across of seemingly power corrupting. A person who's an art student getting the taste of power, becoming extremely Machiavellian in pursuit of that power, and behaving in all sorts of irrational, unethical, and quite violent ways towards other people. So that seems to suggest there's this simplistic narrative. Perhaps there are people for whom power just corrupts. It turns them bad. And the most famous example of this, the one that you come across when you read psychology textbooks about power and corruption, is the Stanford prison experiment. And if you're unfamiliar with this, the story goes that Philip Zimbardo, a researcher in Stanford in the 1970s, built a fake jail in the basement of the psychology department of Stanford University, and started to do an experiment in which half of the students who applied to be part of the experiment were allocated to be prison guards, and half were allocated to be prisoners. And over the ensuing days, the guards, who were just the classmates of these other students, started to abuse and humiliate them in grotesque ways. So grotesque, in fact, that Philip Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time convinced him to shut down the experiment because it was getting so out of hand. So for decades, the story went that the Stanford prison experiment proves that power corrupts. You just need to have the right uniform and your inner demon comes out, and the power is what does that to you. Now, when I was researching this book, I came across a study that basically got no attention that came out in 2007 that flips this entire narrative on its head. So what the researchers in 2007 did was they took the exact same recruitment ad for the Stanford prison experiment. It said, we're recruiting for a psychological study of prison life. We're going to pay you $15 a day. This is back in 1970. And they updated it by just changing it to $70 a day. Everything else was exactly the same. Then in half of the college towns where they ran the experiment, they did a slight tweak to the recruitment language. They said, rather than for a psychological study of prison life, they said, we're recruiting students for a psychological study. And they dropped the of prison life. And then they did psychological screening of the people who showed up to participate in the study. And what they found was really striking. It was that when they included the words for a psychological study of prison life, the people who responded were disproportionately Machiavellian, abusive, authoritarian, narcissistic, psychopathic, etc. And when they had just a neutral frame of for a psychological study, the people generally reflected the population at large. And so for decades, I think we've misunderstood the lesson of this experiment. The lesson seemingly was that power corrupts. Instead, it's perhaps that people who want to be in the uniform, who want to abuse, might be disproportionately self-selecting into those positions where they can then do it with official sanction. And so this raises another wrinkle that we have to think about, is even the most seemingly straightforward examples of power corrupting might have some confounding variables in there where it's actually showing exactly the opposite of what we believe to be the case. And that's where a lot of my book, and this I hope is relevant to many of you who are working in the trenches to fight corruption and fight fraud and abuse and so on, is that systems are really where the interventions matter. Because of course there are psychological aspects, I'm going to talk about more of them, but you're always going to have some bad people who seek power. And so the question is, how do you dial that tendency down and try to dial up the tendency to get good people to seek power, those who will behave with integrity and will avoid fraud, abuse, and corruption? So one of the most important studies that I came across, and I interviewed the researchers who produced this as part of my book writing, was a study that was very simple and elegant in its design. What they did was they asked students to roll a dice 42 times. And then they said, please self-report your scores. So write down exactly what the dice rolls showed. Every time you roll a 6, we're going to give you some money, but please be honest about it. Now, of course, there was no way to check that they were being honest, except for statistics can suggest when people are being dishonest. And there was one student in India who was so brazen as to have listed that he rolled 42 sixes in a row at a 100% rate. So you could tell with reasonable certainty when people were being dishonest. Now, they completed this study in a couple different contexts. One was in India, where the civil service is notoriously bribe-taking and graft is quite common. And another one was in Denmark, where this is quite rare. And in fact, the civil service is notoriously not corrupt. And what they found when they did surveys of the participants in the study, and they matched them up with the dice rolls, and they did statistical analysis to see who was dishonestly reporting, was they found that in India, where going into the civil service had some big payoffs expected with kickbacks and bribes, the students who lied about their dice rolls were disproportionately likely to want to become civil servants. In Denmark, it was exactly the opposite. The results were inverted. And that's because the students who honestly reported their dice rolls wanted to become civil servants. And this is one of those key lessons, I think, that good systems attract good people and rotten systems attract rotten people. It's not simply that power corrupts or that corruptible people seek power. It's that there's an intervening aspect to this in the middle, which is the system that either dials those tendencies up or dials them down. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about an elegant study that tries to disaggregate some of these aspects in a really interesting quasi-experimental way. And I'm going to talk to you about diplomats parking illegally in New York. So in New York City, where the United Nations is headquartered, you have people who have diplomatic immunity to a large degree from especially minor crimes. So if you park illegally, you're not going to go to prison. And in fact, you probably don't even have to pay, up until recently, didn't have to pay your parking fine. This was true until 2002 when Mike Bloomberg decided to change the rules and started thinking about impounding the cars of diplomats who parked illegally. So you have this sort of natural experiment with a pre-enforcement period where the diplomats basically got away with it. It was the sort of Wild West for them when it came to parking. And then there was the post-enforcement period when they actually risked losing their cars. So what did you find? What you'd expect to find, and this is indeed what was the case, is that there was a cultural element to corruption behavior, corrupt style behavior when it came to illegal parking. So the people who were from the quote unquote clean countries, the countries where corruption is low, they tended not to park illegally very much. The places, Japan, Norway, Germany, et cetera, they had low rates of illegal parking. If you get to the places like Yemen, Egypt, et cetera, where there are government cultures of corruption, you found that there were sometimes as much as 192 parking tickets per diplomat on average, right? So some were parking much more than that. And this added up, by the way, for New York City to the tune of $18 million of unpaid parking fines, 150,000 parking tickets from UN diplomats, which is why Bloomberg finally acted in the early 2000s. And what you found was that as the enforcement came into effect, the Yemeni and Egyptian ambassadors and diplomatic staff started parking like the Germans, the Japanese, the Norwegians, almost overnight. They converged at almost zero parking tickets per diplomat. But what's really interesting, this tells quite a nice story already, but the real kicker here, and I think this one is so fascinating, is that if you look on a time scale at how long the various diplomats were in the pre-enforcement period, so let's imagine you've got a German diplomat who has been in New York City for 10 years and has been able to park illegally that entire time without consequences. The longer they were in that lack of enforcement period, the more they started to park illegally. And so this is a nice illustration, I think, of how cultures of corruption really do influence behavior, the sort of idea of I can get away with it, but also accountability can really cause convergence towards following the rules. And that's one of the best natural experiments that illustrates that point in the real world. Now, another aspect about systems of corruption and abuse has to do with the police. And I think one of the things that I've lamented as I've watched the police debate, the police reform debate in the United States, one that's particularly relevant in Minneapolis, is that almost all of the discussion has to do with what the police do, right? Should we put body cameras on police? How should we regulate police conduct? Let's talk about the bad apples in the force. My problem with that is that it's ignoring a massive question related to power and self-selection, which is who the police are and how recruitment and the recruitment strategies used can either reflect a culture of integrity and kindness and compassion, or a culture of militaristic abuse. And so I found this video, this image you're seeing on your screen is from a video screen grab of a recruitment ad that was on the Dorsey, Georgia Police Department up until a couple of years ago. So you click on the video, the first thing you see is the Punisher logo. The Punisher is a anti-hero vigilante who basically captures and then tortures criminals. So this is the beginning of the video to recruit for the police. The next part of the police recruitment video involves the Dorsey, Georgia SWAT team. The population of Dorsey, by the way, is 10,000. It's just outside of Atlanta. And almost every year there are 0 murders. Yet they have a tank. So the image is the tank sort of screaming into view. The hatch opens. They throw out some smoke grenades. They shoot their weapons. They get back in, and the entire thing then screams off out of view. And there's death metal music in the background. And then it says, join the Dorsey Police Department. Now, when you watch that video, if you're a sort of normal person who thinks of policing as community service or trying to keep the peace, you think, maybe that's not what I thought it was going to be. I'm not going to apply. And the people who figure this out, I think, quite effectively, and I interviewed as part of my research the head of recruitment for New Zealand's police department, they recognize that the way you depict policing has a massive impact on who shows up to try to put on the uniform. And so what they did is they invested about $1 million in a recruitment scheme that was aimed at getting a different kind of officer to apply in the first place. So the video, which went viral in New Zealand has 5 million people, by the way, and this video was viewed by 3 million people. So they did a very good job. The PR firm earned its money. But the point was that the video depicts policing as extremely demographically diverse. It's not just sort of the people who you think of when you think of police officers. And it involves lots of depictions like this one, where a police officer stops to help an elderly man cross the road. In the next scene, somebody stops with a boombox and they dance a little bit in the street. And this entire time, they're chasing this unseen perpetrator who has stolen something. And the police are all chasing them down. And finally, they get to the end of the video, and the person they're chasing turns out to be a border collie who's stolen a purse. And on screen, it says, "Do you care enough to be a cop?" I mean, this is the polar opposite of the Dorsey, Georgia Police Department recruitment video in every plausible way. And what happened? Lo and behold, the application numbers shot through the roof. The diversity in the applications they got were massively different. And they also had demographic profiles in terms of psychological profiling that fit a very different type of person from who they originally got. Now, this didn't mean that they didn't have veterans and other people who were trained in firearms applying. Those people still applied. It's just that they had a broader definition and image of what it meant to be a police officer. So people who didn't typically think of themselves in that vein decided to put themselves forward. And this is one of the key ideas I advance in the book, is that self-selection is a massive issue with power seeking and abuse. Is that you have, you think about who shows up to a high school basketball tryout. The people who show up to that are disproportionately likely to be tall. It's not rocket science. When it comes to power seeking, when we say power hungry, we usually mean that as a negative thing. But that is by definition the people who show up to apply for roles of power, because they want power. They're hungry for it. So what you have to think about carefully is how you depict what kind of power hungry person you want to have in the role. Do you want someone who's hungry for public service? Or do you want someone who's hungry to drive around in a tank, toss smoke grenades out, and impose martial law on marshals in Dorsey, Georgia? And I think that's a really key point that gets missed too often in the police debate, not just focusing on what the police do, which is obviously very important, but also thinking more deeply about who the police are with relevance to other systems well beyond policing. Now, I said before I would talk a little bit about psychological profiles, and I think this is important to discuss, is that there is a whole realm of research that exposes the fact that certain personality traits are overrepresented in the halls of power, and they're especially overrepresented in the halls of powerful people who abuse that power, commit abuse and fraud and corruption and so on. And specifically, there are 3 traits that tend to correlate within these people who are psychopaths. It's one of the traits, psychopathy, and it's called the Dark Triad. And the Dark Triad involves psychopathy, being a psychopath, along with Machiavellianism, a psychological personality in which you believe the ends justifies the means. You're gonna get your way no matter what, and also narcissism, this idea of ego driving action. And you have really high correlations in certain people that have these dark triad traits between all three of them. Now, depending on the way you define psychopaths, the way you define these traits, the way you measure them, the best data we have suggests that between 4 times and 100 times more psychopaths occupy top positions of power in Western societies compared to the general population. Even if we take the low estimate of 4 times, that's pretty alarming, right? So we have a serious problem already that psychologically we are talking about people who are different. And these people in particular have effectively different brains from the rest of us. It's not simply a sort of choice. It's not something where you can choose to be a psychopath. There are neurological differences between psychopaths and non-psychopaths that you can measure in the lab. And one of the most interesting aspects of this research looks at how empathy is regulated in people who have dark triad traits. So for most of us, empathy is switched on by default. We have to sort of convince ourselves not to care about other people. And the way you can see this is if you take a person, a normal person, and you put them in an MRI machine and you show them excruciating images of animals or children suffering, most normal people ask to stop the video and their brains are lighting up like fireworks on the scanners. All of their emotional reactions are really lighting up. If you put the same person, a different person with the same video who happens to be a psychopath in that scanner, their brain will look basically dark. They're not reacting. But what's fascinating about this is the neuroscientist who led this study. She told me that she had sort of a stroke of insight while she was doing the study. She said, I wonder what will happen if I ask the psychopaths to imagine what it would be like to care about the children or the animals depicted in the video. So I said, try to imagine what it would be like to have empathy for them. And all of a sudden, their brain scans looked identical to normal people's brains. And so what the takeaway was that when it comes to abusing other people, psychopaths don't have second thoughts. But when it comes to the chameleon-like necessity of blending in as a normal person, pretending to be empathetic, et cetera, psychopaths can actually switch it on by default, by choice rather than by default. And so this provides a real difficulty because it makes us think a bit more about how we design recruitment and promotion strategies around positions of power, particularly ones that are prone to significant abuse. Because when you think about how we do it now, they're basically performances, right? They're performances that involve job interviews of making somebody like you for 45 minutes. And so when you think about that, what are we actually doing? We're rewarding some of the very traits that we know are most destructive when they get into power, because these people are exceptionally good at making people like them for a short period of time. It's called superficial charm in the psychopath literature, but also narcissists are highly, highly attuned to what other people think of them. And therefore, they're also very good at being chameleon-like in certain social situations. And indeed, one of the findings that I discuss is that narcissists, unfortunately, also make more money in modern society for similar reasons. So we've gone through some of the aspects of sort of, does power corrupt? Do corruptible people seek power? Maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. Maybe systems matter. And also there's a psychological element. But now it's the uncomfortable part. Why do we pick such bad leaders? Why do we vote for people who we believe to be snakes? That was the depiction. I wrote a piece for the Sunday Times over in the UK. And this is the cartoon that came up of why do we vote for people who we know are not going to make good leaders? And so there's a couple interesting angles to this. This relates to the irrationality of choice when it comes to leadership selection. One of the most interesting studies I came across in the book, and I talk about it in the introduction, involves children picking an imaginary captain to lead their imaginary ship in a computer simulation. So the way the study was set up was basically the kids are shown 2 faces, given no other information, and they have to click on one of them and say, that's the person I want leading my ship in this computer game. What the kids didn't know was that one of the faces was the winner of a French parliamentary election, and one of the faces was the runner-up of a French parliamentary election. And the overwhelming majority of the time, the kids picked the winner to be the captain of their ship. When they repeated the study with adults, the results were the same. And so, it gives new meaning to this idea of selecting people on face value, which also is compounded by other irrational cognitive biases that exist when it comes to leadership selection. I'm just going to talk about one of those in the next section. So one of the things that one of the types of people that I spoke to for my research here was a realm of research called evolutionary psychology. And what the evolutionary psychologists argue is that when you look at the long scale of human history, our brains have not had time to significantly evolve on a sort of physical chemical basis for the last 50,000 years or so. We basically have the exact same brain structures as our Stone Age ancestors. But a lot has changed in how we live and how our societies function. And so therefore, there's what's called an evolutionary mismatch between what we view as sometimes appealing in leadership and what actually is good for us. And the key example of this is with what are called strongman leaders. And the idea here is that in the Stone Age, especially during times of crisis, it was adaptive. In other words, it helped us survive to pick people who presented themselves as strongmen, physically powerful men. And the idea here is that if you could activate that sense of crisis and fear, you could activate that psychological bias that causes you to gravitate towards strongman leaders. And that's why it's no accident, in my view, that Vladimir Putin routinely is photographed shirtless, because he is activating that latent aspect in our Stone Age brain, so to speak, of understanding that in a moment of crisis, presenting yourself this way is appealing to us, even if it's subconscious. And one of the things that I really came away from my research convinced of is there's a heck of a lot of stuff that influences the way that we promote or identify future leaders that is not based on rational assessments. It's based on other things that are totally, totally separate. One of those areas, by the way, which Putin bucks the trend on this, by the way, is height. So height has been shown to be correlated with lots of stuff related to leadership for similar reasons as the strongman hypothesis with the evolutionary mismatch. And indeed, when they've done psychological studies where they've tried to present people with taller or shorter individuals, where they, using computer techniques, manipulate the exact same person to appear taller or shorter, when they give those survey participants a sort of prime that suggests that there's a moment of crisis, a war, a famine, a pandemic, et cetera, then the effect of height and being physically strong and imposing is magnified in those experiments, even with exactly the same person just being artificially changed to appear to be stronger or taller. Now, the interesting wrinkle, and this is one that I think provides a lot of evidence that the evolutionary psychology people have something right about this, is that the effect only seems to hold true for physically strong, tall men, not for women. And the idea is that it was adaptive in the past to turn to the physically strong male warrior. Now, in Australia, the woman pictured on screen, Hajnal Ban, didn't read the sort of asterisk in the study that it seems to only apply to men. And therefore, she had her legs broken and surgically stretched by 3 inches in pursuit of not even a national level. I believe it was a regional council seat in Queensland. She won, but I don't think the research suggests that it was because of her surgical leg stretching. Now, I want to also talk about one other piece of research that I engaged in before I get into a few solutions and I open things up to questions. One of the difficulties in studying power, corruption, abuse, and fraud in different contexts is it's very, very difficult to disaggregate the person from the system, right? I mean, the UN parking's ticket study gives us a little bit of a window into that, but very often you have sort of a chicken and egg problem, right? I mean, to get to the top of the Egyptian diplomatic corps, you probably can't be a scrupulous person. So maybe there's a sort of, confounding aspect there. So what I wanted to think about is how could I find someone who has operated in 2 systems, the exact same person, and behaved very differently depending on where they were. So I went out to Vermont to interview this man, Paul Bremmer, who, if you remember from just under 20 years ago, he was in charge of Iraq. He was appointed as George W. Bush's viceroy of Iraq in 2003, and he effectively inherited a dictatorship. He was living in Baghdad in one of the Hussein's son's palaces, woken up at 5 a.m. by shelling, nearly blown up in an IED attack at one point as well. But prior to becoming the viceroy of Iraq, he was a person who served with integrity and honor in places as diverse as Malawi and Norway. Now, when I went out to meet with him, this is one of the weirder things I did for the research is, believe it or not, he is now a ski instructor in Vermont. So I grew up downhill ski racing in Minnesota and decided to write to him and say, can I take a ski lesson with you? So I chatted about, what it was like to inherit a dictatorship as we rode the chairlift. And, it was quite unusual because there was a moment where he was talking to someone while we were getting lunch in the chalet. And he said, what's the difference between a ski instructor and a park bench? And he said the answer is that a park bench can support a family of 4. Now, Paul Bremmer, I think, could easily support a family of 4. He's a very rich man. But the point was that I went back to his house and talked to him about what it was like to inherit this dictatorship. And one of the questions I pressed him on was the New York Times reported right after he took over, from leaks that came out of a meeting he held with his staff in Baghdad, in which he floated the idea of shooting looters to restore order in Baghdad. His idea was, we need to show the Iraqis we mean business, and everything is breaking down and a civil war is looming. Therefore, we're going to just send a message by shooting a couple looters in the leg to restore order in Baghdad. So I pressed him on this. I mean, this is something that's quite an extreme response to somebody stealing a TV. And I said, you would never think about doing this in Vermont. You never tried to do this in Malawi or Norway. And he said, yeah, but everything was different. Everything was different in Iraq. I didn't inherit a democracy, so I couldn't pretend that I had to play by the rules of a democracy. And, whatever you think of this morally, I took his point that Paul Bremmer in Norway is not the same as Paul Bremmer in Iraq. And so, I think this is one of those lessons that we have to be very, very careful to learn, is that the system massively influences behavior of individuals. And, as I say, regardless of the moral and, sort of just verdicts that history will have on Paul Bremmer in terms of whether he was a good or bad force in Iraq, I think he is providing an important insight that we should keep in mind, that the individuals are not just individual sort of automatons. They operate within systems that amplify or depress their worst tendencies. And that's where it's up to us to design better systems. So just 2 quick ideas of how we can reduce the corruptible behavior in our systems, drawing both on the power of randomness. And then I'll happily open it up to questions to explore some of these ideas a bit more. One of the people I interviewed for my research was the former head of internal affairs at the NYPD. And what he did was really an ingenious attempt to try to reduce the levels of corruption and abuse within the force. What occurred to him was that you don't need to police everybody, but you need to make the police fear that they're potentially being watched when they're about to commit a crime. So what he developed were called integrity tests. And basically it went like this. A police officer would be told to go to secure a crime scene. They would say, look, we've been told there's a crime scene. Nobody's attended it yet. Could you just secure it? And then the force will arrive with backup, or the DEA will come to collect the drugs that you find in the apartment. So there would be about $20,000 in cash on the table. There would be a series of bags of drugs. And the police officer would not know that the whole place was wired up with video cameras and microphones and so on. And what they would do is they'd watch to see if the police officer stole the money and then reported, say, $14,000 instead of $20,000. Now, what was fascinating about this was that they did 500 of these integrity tests throughout the NYPD. Then they did surveys where they asked cops in the NYPD, were you subject to an integrity test in the last 12 months? And what they found was that 12,000 officers said that they were, even though only 500 had actually been. So 11,500 of them had gone to real crime scenes with real cash and real drugs on the table and thought they were being set up. And everybody else in the force who didn't think they had been set up knew that they could be set up. And so this caused a dramatic reduction in the rates of police abuse. One of the weirder things about the integrity test, by the way, you can imagine your job description being this. He also designed integrity tests in which he would get a person to dress in plain clothes and be as annoying and aggressive as possible to a police officer to see if he could get them to punch him. And inevitably, if they did, there would be severe consequences. They were basically checking to see if they could provoke the officer to use violence against the civilian population they were supposed to be protecting. So that shows you the power of, when you have surveillance, you don't want to have a dystopian society in which everybody is watched. I mean, I don't believe in the idea of sort of, baiting the break room fridge to check who's stealing your sandwich. But I do think for positions of extreme power that are especially prone to abuse and embezzlement and fraud and so on, and violence, that a bit of randomization can go a really long way in threading that needle between a sort of surveillance state and one that provides a healthy dose of concern that you might get caught if you behave badly in a position of power. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a sort of outside the box idea, but one that I still think could pay some serious dividends both in politics and business. And it draws on the idea of random oversight. So what you're seeing is the image of a claritarion, which is a device in ancient Athens used to develop a roster of a citizens' assembly that basically was jury duty for politics. So they randomly selected citizens, and then those citizens decided on issues of the day. Now, in the 21st century, I don't believe in this concept of sortition, which is what it's called in political science now, of random selection of political leaders, because I think that politics is too complicated in the 21st century for people who don't have specialist knowledge to make decisions. You don't want the average person negotiating a nuclear test ban treaty, probably. But I do think there is some serious value in using random sortition or random selection to provide oversight to people with power. So the way that I envision this working is something like you develop a shadow Congress, let's imagine, where 435 people for the House, 100 people for the Senate are randomly selected. They're given identical information on the major issues of the year. They hold votes that are non-binding, and they provide a clear juxtaposition with the actual political leaders. So when the actual political leaders do something for the wrong reasons, because a lobbyist told them to or paid them to, or because they want to get reelected in a highly partisan district, the random assortment of citizens probably won't do this. And it will provide a nice check where you can say, why are you out of step with how the random group of Americans might behave in this situation? And of course, the analogy holds well with business, right? You could have a shadow board of directors randomly selected from the employees of the company. Now, in Germany, there are shadow boards at times, but they're not randomly selected. So you don't have anything to deal with that self-selection problem I was discussing of people self-selecting into power for perhaps the wrong reasons. And so I do believe that this aspect of randomness could pay some serious dividends in both business and politics with very limited cost, to be honest. It's just an additional check that wouldn't actually have binding decision-making power, but could provide a healthy bit of scrutiny to people who often are not checked sufficiently, in my view. And with that, I will happily turn things over to questions. I've covered a lot of different ground, so I'm happy to discuss whatever you'd like. But thank you so much for hosting me, and thank you, Jay, for the kind introduction, and for the Dorsey firm for all of its wonderful benefits that I've accrued as a result of it over the years.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Klaas. I want to take a few minutes to both talk to you about your book, which I have read and found to be terrific and fascinating, and to get into specifics that I hope will appeal more to the people that are both dialed in through the webinar and are present here. And one of the things I noticed about your book that I enjoyed very, very much, Dr. Klaas, was your use of stories. Every one of your chapters begins with a story, both of either current affairs, historical story, or the like. What led you, first of all, to use that as a technique to present the subject matters on which you desired to address?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I feel passionately about. So I picked this for a couple reasons. One is that humans are, in my view, hardwired to make sense of the world through narratives and stories. For the lawyers in the audience, I think, especially the trial lawyers, this is a lesson you learn when you're talking to juries, I'm sure. And so, I think illustrating points with stories makes them much more memorable, especially when you're introducing sometimes quite complicated research. I mean, I have to talk about what neuroscience evidence suggests when it comes to, why we have bad leaders. And I think making that a bit more vivid through the aspect of narrative and real world examples also forces me to prove that this exists, right? That there are actually examples of what I'm talking about, which I think is important. Picking the stories was a tricky thing to do. I mean, there's lots of people I interviewed. I interviewed about 500 people for the book. And one of the tricky things was to determine which fit with the best aspect of what I wanted to say, because often they overlapped, right? I mean, some of these stories involve multiple lessons, and trying to figure out which one to allocate to which chapter was tricky. I also have, and this is one of those difficulties of being a writer, a lot of stories I wish I had time to tell, but that I cut for word count, or my editor killed off, or whatever. I mean, I interviewed a guy who led a for-profit mercenary attempted takeover of Equatorial Guinea and ended up in prison for a long time. It just didn't fit in the book perfectly, so it didn't end up making the cut. But it's just trying to find those ones that will also connect with people. And one of the things perhaps we'll talk about it in a bit is I also tried to find stories that were closer to home. I mean, my research is, I've met many heads of state, former heads of state. I've met many people who are accused of war crimes or who ordered torture, torture victims. And I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to view those as anything but an abstraction. It's not something they can latch onto. So one of the challenges actually for me as a political scientist was finding stories that were much more ordinary. And so I have a couple. I have a psychopathic janitor and the tyrant of a homeowners association in Arizona that I talk about in the book to try to make things a bit more relatable to people who may not have shook hands with a war criminal or a former despot.
One of the stories that I found remarkable was the one that introduced your first lesson. His book ends with 3 chapters that consist of 10 lessons, and the lesson is entitled Actively Recruit Incorruptible People and Screen Out Corruptible Ones. And that story, which really talks about attracting a deep and wide pool of applicants, really drove the story home. Perhaps you can just summarize it briefly and then talk about the lesson that comes from it.
Sure. So the story is about a sort of township village in Alaska called Stebbins, Alaska, where, believe it or not, and this is, I mean, it's very well verified, every single police officer in the township's police department, and there were several of them, this wasn't just 1 or 2 people, had been convicted of significant felony crimes. All of them had domestic abuse convictions. So if you were in Stebbins and you were getting, attacked by your partner, you would bring a domestic abuser to your door if you called 911, another domestic abuser. The chief of police had 17 different convictions. And the reason for this was, as the person who was sort of in charge of the city government said to various reporters, we keep trying to recruit and no one wants to do the job. So, there was one person who called up and he had just been released from prison. And the next day he was in a uniform patrolling the streets. The lesson I take from that is that some of the time we lament the people who end up in power without thinking enough about the systems that attract those people in the first place. So this idea of deepening and broadening are 2 ideas that I advocate for. Deepening just means make the pool of applicants deeper. Think carefully about how you recruit. There's one example of computer science departments starting to think how they can get more women to decide to be computer science majors. And a couple of them that just tweaked things a bit, didn't spend that much effort on this, had their rates go from 7% of their cohort to 42% in the span of a couple of years, just by thinking more carefully about how their recruitment worked. So that's the deepening idea. The broadening is also related to what I was just talking about with computer science of getting different kinds of applicants. So the story about the New Zealand police is a story of both deepening and broadening. It's a story where you get more applicants and you also get different kinds of applicants. And that way, when you pick, you're not just stuck with those people in Stebbins, Alaska, who are undesirable and clearly corruptible when it comes to power.
Let's switch to the people that you interviewed. You talked about how you interviewed up to 500 world leaders, corrupt people just having left jail. And looking at page 7 of your book, you make this comment: it's startling how rarely they live up to the caricature of evil. They're often charming. They crack jokes and smile. At first glance, they don't appear to be monsters, but many were. Can you give us a highlight or 2 of the most fascinating people that you interviewed and those that perhaps frightened you the most?
Yeah, I mean, so in the first chapter of the book, I talk about a former president of Madagascar that I've met many times over the years. I've met him 7 or 8 times, named Mark Ravalomanana. And he's a fascinating power corrupt story. So he grew up selling yogurt off the back of his bicycle, grew up poor, and with a well-timed loan was able to build that sort of yogurt off the back of a bicycle business into Madagascar's dairy empire and became the richest man in Madagascar as a sort of yogurt kingpin, if you will, and then became the president of Madagascar. And he was deposed in 2009 in a coup d'etat by a radio disc jockey who was 34 at the time, named André Joël. And the amazing thing about it is that he came in as a reformer. He passed a anti-corruption law. He set up an anti-corruption watchdog called Bianco. And then he, over time, let the power go to his head, so to speak, and started doing all sorts of corrupt things himself, which ultimately led to his downfall. He even licensed the presidential aircraft, which he somewhat ambitiously named Air Force Two for Madagascar, in his own name rather than in the name of the state. Now, what was interesting about him was that you think of this person who's grown up in one of the poorest countries in the world, in one of the poorest communities in that country, selling yogurt off the back of a bicycle. I imagine he would be sort of humble. And yet when I met him, we had breakfast on this table that was, it was out of a film, right? 20 feet long, filled with food, with two seats, one for him and one for me on either end. And he sort of has a bell that he rings when he wants anything, and his servants race each other to provide him with what he wants as quickly as possible. And it's clear that there's benefits to being faster in that race. So, he was a fascinating character where you can sort of see this ordinary person get warped by their power. The other one I wanted to just quickly mention is the former Prime Minister of Thailand, who I met in Bangkok 5 or 6 times over the years. The first time I met him, though, it was this classic case of mistaken identities. He thought I was going to be older than I was. So he, didn't recognize me at first. I thought he was going to be wearing a suit and tie as opposed to a t-shirt. And so we ended up in this hotel cafe, the only 2 people in it, both looking around, and we ended up emailing each other saying, I'm here, I'm already there. And we laughed about it and met. The point was, he was wearing a t-shirt because he had just donated blood, he told me. Now, I have no idea whether he was trying to manipulate me. This is totally possible that he was, because he is known for having ordered live bullets to be used on protesters a little over a decade ago, in which nearly 100 people were killed. So, given that he understood that I was going to see him in this light, perhaps he decided to tell me he had just donated blood. What was fascinating about him, and this is something, I've been honest about when I write about him and when I talk about him, I like him. I don't mean this in a moral way. I mean this in a personal way. He's a very likable individual. And it's so difficult when you're sitting next to someone drinking a cappuccino, shaking their hand, and they're making you laugh, and they're funny and enjoyable to chat to. And in the back of your mind, that at some point he gave an order that caused nearly 100 people to get shot and killed. So, that's the really disorienting thing about my work, is that you end up on a human level encountering people who are these larger than life monsters on a level of how they behaved. And so you have to find a way to write about them that acknowledges both the human side and the terrible aspects of what they committed while they were in power.
You spoke during your presentation about how power corrupts, or how corrupt people are lured to positions of power. And you spoke about the importance of systems, and the audience that we have here today are people that work within systems that are intended to, and their focus is on preventing corruption and putting into place those systems that will achieve a more ethical environment. On page 110 of your book, you say, "We as humans are horribly inept at deciphering the difference between awful people and awful systems." Can you explain that a little bit more, and how it might apply in the context of the people here?
Yes. So I've talked a few times. My own personal view is that the way that people behave is a fundamental interaction between sort of their character, or their nature or nurture aspects of them, and the systems they inhabit. And so, you have very interesting situations where the Thai prime minister I just spoke about is a great example of this, where the way he explained his decision to me, the one in which he ended up killing those protesters, or ordering them to be killed, was he believed that he was stopping a civil war from happening. And as I describe in the book, it's not a totally implausible point of view given what was happening. There were rocket-propelled grenades being fired in Bangkok, and the opposition was talking of a civil war. Now, this does not absolve what he did in any way, but he was not operating in a highly confined, constrained Fortune 500 company. right? I mean, there's a different system that he was operating in. And also in Thai politics, I mean, you might get killed if you lose power, which tends to focus the mind a bit. So what I think about when I try to, speak about this in ways that are closer to home is if you acknowledge the system matters a lot, what you want to do is design systems, not on autopilot, not on sort of that's the way we did it in the past, let's keep doing it, but just engineer the system from the ground up to imagine that the worst possible dark triad psychopath is going to relentlessly try to get into the position that you're advertising for. And then design the system to block them at every stage and constrain them at every stage, to find them out at every stage. And if you do that in a sort of sensible way, I think it's a very effective tool to actually reducing these tendencies. So one of them that I talk about in the book is this idea of rotation. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest in psychological research that collusion becomes much more common the more that you get entrenched in a position without any sort of shocks to it by new people coming in or any elements of oversight applying to you. So rotation in police forces, for example, the Metropolitan Police in London, they rotate partners regularly to ensure that there's less corruption in the force. And indeed, one of the worst places for corruption in the UK had an anti-drugs unit that was a closed system with no rotation. And there was a huge amount of embezzlement going on. It's one of the worst police scandals in British history. So, these are not things that are new to many of you. You work in the trenches, you know about this. My frustration in encountering lots and lots of systems is how many of them are not designed from the ground up with this aim. There's just around the edges tweaks that tend to happen as opposed to systematic design to reduce this tendency of power-hungry people to seek and obtain power.
As it relates to systems themselves, you state that systems matter and culture matters, but so do consequences. In other words, the system in which you operate, and you gave good examples during your presentation of being the head of Iraq at the beginning of the US occupation and operating in a country with a far more ethical culture. To what extent do consequences matter in making certain that systems bring about proper behavior?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have pretty good evidence that they matter a lot. And it's not just because of fear of consequences. It's also because of the model they set for everybody lower on in the hierarchy. But it is more complicated than that with psychopaths, which I'll come back to in a second. So one of the pieces of evidence that I came across in my research was a study of corrupt behavior in West Africa, in which the anti-corruption approach, in one instance, tried to deal with sort of daily corruption. It dealt with lots of the sort of ins and outs of what civil servants were doing and so on, which is obviously of huge value. But also they did another attempt, which was to take down the sort of corrupt kingpins that were setting the agenda for everybody else in the hierarchy. And they found that this is one of the areas where trickle-down principles actually work very, very well, that holding accountable the top of an organization has some significant impacts on the culture of the organization writ large, which is, of course, something that we've seen in corporate scandals in the United States as well. Now, the reason I mentioned the psychopaths, though, is because they're the trickiest people to deal with, precisely because they do not believe the rules apply to them. So psychopaths have a very high level, and so do some power holders in general, of something called illusory control. And it's well documented that illusory control tends to aggregate in people the longer they're in power, where they believe that they can control outcomes that they actually can't control. So they think that the rules basically don't apply to them, they'll get away with it, and so on. And psychopaths in particular discount risk. So they believe that when they enter a highly risky situation, everybody else is a chump and they're going to get the consequences to catch up with them, but I won't because I'm smarter than them. You tend to see this quite a lot. And in fact, the dysfunctional psychopaths who are bad at getting away with it, in the sort of psychopathy literature, the people who study psychopaths, what they say is the people who aren't good at getting away with it, they're in jail. They're the serial killers. They can't control their impulses. The functional psychopaths, as they're known, are the ones who are in boardrooms and in politics because they've gotten really good at making sure that they actually do get away with it. So accountability does matter, but it's less of a deterrent for people, who have high levels of this idea of illusory control, where they think the rules don't apply to them.
One of the questions we got from those that have dialed in says, can having detailed policies and procedures on how an organization should run help keep people become less corruptible? What did you find in terms of systems that have policies and procedures?
Yeah, so there's not a one size fits all roadmap, and one of the things, I mean, I'm well aware I'm speaking to people who deal with the nitty gritty in lots of different contexts in the real world, which is why I devoted the last third of the book to principles. Principles that can help with this. And so rotation is one of them. The random oversight is one of them. The random sortition is one of them, and so on. The attracting more incorruptible people in the first place. And I go through those because I think that there is not a one size fits all approach. I don't think that you can say, if we pass this law, corruption will plummet. And the reason why I think that's true is because people are exceptionally good at gaming the system. So one of the aspects that I lament, if you think about corruption indices, for example, in politics, is when you look at a map from like Transparency International and they have the corruptions perceptions index, the places that are sort of the ones you would expect are the ones that are red, right? The places that often end in stan and so on, they have high levels of corruption. And the places that are seemingly uncorrupt, often in the West, are green. And yet, if you look at where the people who are in the red countries are funneling their money through, they're often through the green countries, right? In what are called corruption services. And so, to my mind, there's a real issue here where you can have well-designed systems, you can have well-intentioned people, but unless you understand how this actually operates within the given system, how they're getting around the rules, you're not going to be able to write any legislation, any policy that is bulletproof. And that's why in writing these 10 principles, I say they're basically layered on top of each other. None of them will be a silver bullet alone. But if you have a systematic ground-up review of how you can deter bad apples from seeking power, how you can constrain them when they get power, how you can design promotion systems to weed them out, and so on. Over time, I think it has quite a virtuous circle aspect to it where you can get some really big knock-on effects. But I wouldn't pretend to have a silver bullet because I don't believe one exists.
Another question that we received was, what does your research say about the utility and value of conducting training, in particular here, compliance training? Does training regularly help reduce the propensity of people to act in a corrupt way?
Yeah, there's mixed evidence about this that I've come across, and the main finding that I think resonates with what I've tended to observe is it really depends on how the training is operated and how people perceive it. I mean, I'm probably not the only person on this call or in this conference who has gone through a training session that they believed was a tick box exercise, and they got almost nothing out of it. And you're sort of just trying to click through if it's an online training and so on. And I don't think that helps very much. I think that there are other elements of training and speaking about anti-corruption and anti-fraud that can be much more powerful. And this is where I think, the power of narrative, I talked about this at the beginning about why I pick stories, is so helpful because it provides people with something to latch onto, real world examples of how these compliance efforts actually made a difference in another company, or cautionary tales about what happens if you don't end up engaging in the correct procedures within your business. So, I think that there is a real problem in pinpointing the actual effectiveness of a given policy like compliance training, because it varies so much about the environment, the actual training being used, and the way it's perceived. But I think you have to try. I mean, I think this is one of the points that I hope comes through, is that I don't believe we're ever going to live in a world where purely incorruptible people will seek and obtain power. And I don't believe we're ever going to design a system that's going to reduce corruption close to zero. I think the question is, are there low-hanging fruits that can dial the needle down in terms of reducing the avoidable corruption and fraud and abuse and so on in our systems? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, the number of times that I came across systems where it was either a tick box exercise or it wasn't even thought about at all, that was the maddening aspect to me in so much of corporate and political life, especially in other parts of the world. But there are mechanisms, I think, that can make this a less corrupt, less abusive, less fraud-prone society.
You you talk about among your lessons, one of the lessons that you have is what I would refer to as distancing, that people that put themselves in corrupt positions are able to act in a way that truly is corrupt, if not completely free of guilt in how they treat other people. And you talk about distance in terms of time, space, socially, different classes of people, and experientially. How do you bring people that are corrupt closer to the people that their corruption is impacting in a way that might change their behavior?
Yeah, so this was an area that I found absolutely fascinating. It's a concept called psychological distance. There's a study that looks at how soldiers behave when they actually have to kill someone up close, right? And there's a study that looks at Gettysburg rifles that were recovered from the battlefield, and something like 90% of them were still loaded when they were recovered because people found it very difficult to shoot and kill somebody at close range. And that suggests there's this concept of psychological distance where the more we identify with, see the impact of our abusive behavior, if we're not a psychopath, the more that it's difficult for us to inflict that on another human being. And so one of the things that I lament in writing about this is that we're designing systems that are deliberately creating psychological distance between people in power and people who are controlled by those in power. And what I mean by this is you have, for example, the euphemistic alphabet soup of corporate downsizing consultants to go in and fire people so that the person who makes that decision doesn't ever have to interact with the individual. We have, stratified corporate hierarchies where you often don't know your boss, who's in some faraway headquarters, et cetera. And all of the research suggests that the more that you get psychologically distant from someone, the easier it is for you to behave badly towards them because you start to see them as an abstraction. I mean, we think about this in political life. Talking about migrants or immigrants is very, very different from talking about a specific migrant or immigrant that you know. And it's because people become abstract categories as opposed to individuals. So one of the things that I'm worried about, honestly, I mean, we're sitting here on a Zoom call, right? Is one of the things that I worry will happen in the post-pandemic world is there will be a significant increase in the level of psychological distance in corporate life because people who have those normal interactions won't have them as much anymore, which makes it easier to fire someone. I mean, think about the conscience of someone who's involved in a toxic oil spill, for example, thousands of miles away versus if it's in your own community. You're going to feel differently about that. So my view is that anytime you're designing a system, you want what I believe is a Goldilocks solution to this problem. You don't want CEOs who know every single person in the company and spend all their time empathizing with them, but you also don't want them to have complete distance from all the decisions they're actually involved in. And I talk a little bit in the book about examples of how you can bring people a bit closer together to make them see the consequences of their action so they at least feel it a bit more viscerally.
Indeed, in one of the lessons that you talk about the concept of oversight and being watched, and you make the remarkable assertion that most corporate cultures are watching the wrong people. They're watching the rank and file as opposed to those people that are in positions of power. How do you go about implementing that type of a system? And can you explain a little bit more the concept that I just mentioned?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of oversight within companies that I've seen, especially since the pandemic has changed the way that many of us work, where, these sort of dystopian technologies of chair sensors being deployed to make sure that you're sitting in your chair at the prescribed time. You're not actually up on a lunch break. And the argument that I make is when you look at those sort of flagship examples of corporate malfeasance, it's not because somebody stole a paperclip or took too long of a lunch break, right? It's decisions that were made much higher up in the corporate hierarchy that were not being scrutinized. And yet we have ever increasing technological surveillance of rank and file employees who frankly are unable to bring the company down or would find it very difficult to bring the company down if they're low enough in the hierarchy. So I think there's a balance, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that the board and, the people in the corner offices are constantly filmed or anything like that. I just think that there should be a bit more of a rebalancing. And one of the areas I suggest that is that sort of random sortition for oversight it's also just about the idea of having checks on people in positions of authority rather than just allowing them to develop the checks. And I think that is, it's a lesson about getting that balance right that I think we have skewed very, very badly in the wrong direction towards people who are less likely to actually be the sources of major consequential corporate and political malfeasance.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I would be remiss, and one of the questions reminds me that it might be useful for you to comment on current international affairs, and particularly Vladimir Putin and his actions and behavior towards Ukraine. Where does he fit into the characters that you examined in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple angles. I mean, I obviously talked about his strongman aspect, and I do think that there was evidence that his popularity was flagging in Russia prior to the invasion. Whether this was an astute move, I think it's quite clear he miscalculated badly. But there is an argument to be made that he was trying to prime that crisis frame in which a strongman leader is the desirable leader. The other thing I've written about more recently is this idea of what's called the dictator trap. And it's taking seriously the notion that power, and the longer you inhabit it, actually does affect your psychological processes and indeed your neurochemistry, which I talk about a bit in the book. The example I mentioned with Putin is that he's constructed an entire fake reality around him, rife with propaganda and state media that parrots lies back to him. And then the people around him have been whittled out since he took power in 2000. So over the last 22 years, all the people who stood up to him are now gone from the Kremlin. Now, when you think about how people in positions of power make decisions, that is the worst possible way. It's the exact opposite of the team of rivals approach that Abraham Lincoln used to have his rivals debate him in the White House. And so, to my mind, Putin is both emblematic of larger things about evolutionary mismatch and so on, but also about the pitfalls of how leaders choose, when they have enough latitude, to be unchecked by those around them, to reward the sort of people who just parrot their lies back to them and start to get delusional, frankly, by believing the own false reality that they've constructed. And I think that's why Putin miscalculated so catastrophically in invading in a way that's now going to set back Russia several decades in terms of economic growth.
When you interviewed people like that, and based upon your studies, what's the end game? I mean, all of these people know that they can't live forever, that they can't remain in power forever, that at some point there needs to be a transitioning of power. I think during my lifetime, for example, Fidel Castro and his passage of power, how do they think in that regard? Do they get to the point where they think that they're Superman or Superwoman and that they don't think about the end game?
I actually think they do think about the end game, but the end game doesn't give them many good options. It's sometimes referred to as the dictator's treadmill, something that you can't get off. And the research that I've done myself, I crunched the numbers at one point in what happened to dictators in sub-Saharan Africa when they lost power. And 43% of them were either jailed, exiled, or killed upon losing power. I mean, it's the opposite of the book tour and the corporate speaking riches that you get in the US when you leave politics. So they don't have an exit option basically a lot of the time. And as a result, it starts to look very rational why you rig elections and repress your population if the alternative is ending up in a jail cell dead or forced out of your country with a coin flip of predictability. So I think a lot of these people are partly conditioned by that and partly because they end up in a situation where they just love the taste of power and they can't give it up. And I think Vladimir Putin is one of those people who simply cannot imagine not being the center of Russia's universe and probably will not willingly give up power and is therefore more likely to end in a casket.
All right. Well, I think we've run out of time. I want to thank you very much, Professor Klaas, for your presentation. For those of you on the webinar and that are here personally, stick around. We're going to take a 10-minute stretch break, and we'll then proceed to our second presentation, which is, again, a panel of highly knowledgeable people talking about the recent developments. Thank you.